21st century life, it seems like it just keeps moving faster and faster, and it seems to get more hectic and busy, even though we seem to not be doing as much because we're not trying to go out with the pandemic. And our world seems more polarized and divisive than I think ever before. And with all of this, with the speed, with the conflict all around us, we spend, I think, more and more time and energy seeking peace. For some, that means seeking peace in a spiritual discipline. Maybe for you it's prayer or simply some time of silence or time reading scripture. Some people spend a lot of money seeking peace. They may go to a spa or get a massage or take a few days and go on vacation, and they may find a few hours or a few days of peace. I'll admit I have a meditation app on my phone, which I will use when I need to find a few minutes of quiet to clear my mind, or those days and nights when it's a hard time getting the brain to shut down and go to sleep at night. But this is a joyful day for me because I, as your pastor, can stand here and tell you with great confidence, I know that you are all seeking a certain type of peace. And I can tell you with great confidence, you will find that peace. And I can tell you when you will find it. You will wake up Wednesday morning, turn on the TV, open the newspaper, and there will not be another campaign ad in sight. It will be done. Election day will have come and gone, and we'll be back to just the usual annoying campaigns and robocalls of life, as opposed to all the political advertisements we're getting through these last few days of the election. Peace is something we seek, and peacemakers are one of the groups or one of the traits listed in the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes, of course, are that first portion of the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew. It is the single largest collection of the teachings of Jesus, sort of in one hunk in the Gospels. And those verses are probably some of the most well-known of that section. And they're really well-known, but I think sometimes they're harder to understand than we think they are at first glance. They give us that list, right, that describes people, those who mourn, those who are meek, those who are merciful. And I think our first reaction is to try to put people in boxes, because we tend to naturally want to classify people. We say, oh, well, those are the merciful people, and those are the meek people, and of course they're mourning right now. But it isn't so much about how we classify people as this is how we live our lives as children of God, and how we live as a community of faith. We're all going to have these traits or live these things at some time in all of our lives. We will all mourn at some point. There will be a time when we all hunger and thirst for righteousness, when we are seeking to understand what it is God is calling us to be in our lives. So we are all called to be peacemakers. Now that title of being a peacemaker wouldn't have been typical for an ordinary person when Jesus was teaching. Roman emperors were often, though, considered to be peacemakers. And that was often a title they were given as someone who was a peacemaker who brought peace. They brought peace to the land they governed. Of course, they did it through less than peaceful means. They did it through war and brute force and intimidation. I don't think that's the kind of peace God has in mind for any of us. The peace of conquering another nation. It's about being in relationship with God and in relationship with one another. I've been thinking about this partly because it's a part of my life and part of really why I'm here today. If you've been around Methodism for any length of time, you surely know that all of us as pastors have what we refer to as a call story. It's that story that we will tell about sort of how and when we've discerned that this is where we have called to be, that God has called us to be in vocational ministry. And as you begin this process of entering ministry, it's something you write about and talk about quite a bit. And when you're like me and you begin ministry in your 50s, that story is kind of long and winding and has lots of fits and starts. It starts for me in college, and I originally then said no, and God nudged 2 or 3 times, and I kept trying to put it off, and finally in 2015 I said yes. And even then, as I began the process of candidacy, I wasn't really sure what was going to happen or what I wanted to do or where exactly this was all heading. I really thought I might finish candidacy and then in 15 and simply be a candidate for a while as I tried to figure out where I was being called, and my kids would finish high school, and then maybe there'd be a plan. That was my plan, not God's plan. God's plan became clear almost 4 years ago to this Sunday, because it would have been the Sunday after the 2016 election. That election cycle was perhaps the most divisive, polarizing, nasty, angry campaign that I think I had ever seen in my life. So the Sunday afterwards, I was helping lead worship at my church, and I was there early and had some quiet time to sort of help myself focus and prepare. I was thinking about that election which had just occurred, and not so even much about who won and who lost, but how do we move forward? How do we find ways to speak with one another? How can we relate to each other when it seemed like all anybody wanted to do was shout at each other and not even take time to listen to what anybody else was saying? As I thought about that, I thought about how we came together, how we found any sort of peace and unity as communities, that voice. And maybe it comes to you in different ways, but we all have sometimes that still small voice that you know is God speaking to you. The words were, you have a voice, use it. And that's when I realized I had to get off the bench and join the game. And I couldn't sit back any longer, and I've now pursued ministry. You know, I said 2016 was the most divisive, polarizing, nasty, angry political campaign season I had ever seen in my life. Can we all agree that 2016 was like an afternoon tea party compared to what we've seen now through 2020? Yeah, lots of heads nod to that one. I think it began this spring as we saw businesses shut down at the beginning of the pandemic. We've witnessed armed protests around some of that. And then we saw racial tensions boiling over this spring, really beginning in May around the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. More violence then through the spring and the summer months. And while a lot of that was focused around systemic racism, which has been part of America for 400 years, more and more of it is focused towards our politics. It's directed at our political systems. There was a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan. There were people arrested for that. This week there were a group of apparent Trump supporters in vehicles that tried to either stop or run a Biden campaign bus off the road on I-35 in Texas. There have been acts of vandalism against Trump supporters by the other side, so I don't want to make this sound like I'm particularly one way or the other. They reversed this decision, but at one point this week, Walmart pulled their guns and ammunition from their shelves because they were worried about the potential for civil unrest following the election. Then there's the concerns about foreign governments interfering in the election process. Okay, I don't know about you. You put all that list together. Concerns about whether or not an election will be free and fair. Concerns about post-election violence, which some say could actually devolve into civil war. Questions about whether or not there'll be a peaceful transfer of power if a sitting head of state loses an election. These are the types of situations I'm used to hearing that we as Americans are going somewhere else in the world to help a nation resolve and work their way through. Not things that happen here within our nation. That's one of the reasons as we've approached this election, there's an entry from John Wesley's journal that's really taken on some new meaning for me over the last week. I suspect many of you have heard this before, and I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure in all the forms I filled out for candidacy, I signed something somewhere that says I have to reference this once every political campaign season. But maybe not, but we're going to be on the safe side anyway. Kidding about Wesley's journal aside, it is a gift. John Wesley was a prolific journal writer, and it gives us a lot of insight into his life and his ministry. This is his journal entry from October 6th of 1774. I met with those of our society who had votes in the ensuing election and advised them, 1, to vote without fee or reward for the person they judged most worthy. 2, to speak no evil of the person they voted against. And 3, to take care their spirits were not sharpened against those that voted on the other side. Now, while I believe we're called to live as followers of Christ in the world today, I also believe that includes how we engage each other in politics. And as I talk about this, I'm going to renew to you a promise I've made to all the congregations I've served. I'm never going to stand up here and tell you how to vote. For one reason, I know not everyone, even seated here, will all vote for the same candidates. And whether your candidate wins on Tuesday or loses on Tuesday, on Wednesday, I'm still your pastor. But as I reflect on that journal entry from 1774, I'm going to trust that you have listened to that first piece of advice and have taken it to heart or will take it to heart if you voted early or going to vote in the next couple days, that you will make thoughtful, informed decisions and you will choose the candidates you feel are most worthy of your support. But I think the thing that really hit me this year that hadn't before as I read those 3 pieces of advice from John Wesley is that's the only one that stops on election day. The first piece of that you're done with after you cast the vote. The second and third piece of advice continue on. There's still work to be done. The work of not speaking evil against the person simply because you didn't vote for them. And the idea of not letting your spirits be hardened or not letting your heart be hardened against those on the other side. That's probably even harder than deciding who you vote for. And that's work that continues on well past Tuesday. It's harder, but I also think it's more important because whether you're Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, none of the above, beyond that, we're all part of America. We are all here as citizens of the United States. And we have to find ways to work together to make this government work. But we're also children of God. We're followers of Jesus, and we are called then to love our neighbor. We're called to bring light where there is darkness. We're called to be peacemakers. A group who has taken on this task, not necessarily from a spiritual direction, but from another point of view, it's a group of citizens that are helping to reinforce not only what we have in common, but our responsibilities to each other, our civic duty. It's a group called Citizen University. It was founded in Seattle and founded in that aftermath of that 2016 election cycle that was nasty and sort of really polarizing. One of the founders is Eric Liu. It's near and dear to him, I think, for several reasons. One is he is the son of immigrants. So he believes strongly in what it is that makes America what it is. He was also a speechwriter in the Clinton White House. He and the other people who founded this organization saw a need to actively teach people what it meant to be a good citizen, what it meant to live into your civic duty. And they tried to do it by organizing an event. The event was going to be called Civic Saturday. They hosted it at a bookstore in Seattle. They hoped 40 people would come to the first one. 220 showed up. Civic Saturdays are now happening in cities across America. A typical Civic Saturday gathering, people come together in some sort of common space. There's often music that connects us to who we are as Americans. There will be readings from historical writings, everything from the Federalist Papers to a John F. Kennedy speech, anything in between. There may be a poetry reading, something that reminds us who we are, what we have in common, something that connects with the heart instead of the mind. One of the organizers or the leaders then has often done some research and thoughtfully prepared a talk, a lecture about a particular topic around civics or citizenship. They actually call it a civic sermon. A group of people gathering together to use music and reading and poetry and listening to someone expand on a concept and apply it to modern life. Are you starting to get a sense of deja vu? Do you feel like you've been in something like that at any time recently? I'm hoping you are, because you're in it right now. Civic Saturday actually used Sunday morning worship as their model for how they were going to organize a gathering to get people together, to give them a sense of common identity and common purpose, and teach them what it meant, and then to send them back out into the world to live into what it meant to be an American citizen. They've taken exactly what we do to worship God and celebrate who we are as the body of Christ, and then go out into the world to serve God and use that as a model for how they're wanting to change the world as well. And as we look at these days and weeks that are about to come, Lou writes that something he learned in the White House he thinks is important for us all to remember. Eric Liu wrote President Clinton's speech for the 50th anniversary commemoration of D-Day, that invasion of Normandy, which was really the beginning of the end of the European conflict in World War II. To begin that process, he and the speechwriting staff did a lot of research, which wouldn't be uncommon. They read prior speeches that the presidents before them had given on prior anniversaries of D-Day. President Reagan spoke at the 40th anniversary of D-Day, and they looked back at those. They looked back at the history of the event and read the military history. They read firsthand accounts of soldiers that fought on the beaches that day in 1944. And he says, here's what he learned that he took away from that. While we focus on that one day, on D-Day, and maybe on all the preparation that led up to the beginning of that invasion, he said, it wasn't that day, but it was also the work of D-Day plus 1, and D-Day plus 2, plus 4, plus 7, plus 14, plus 100. That was when the work of ending that war, when the work of saving the world really happened. It began on those beaches on that day, but it didn't end there. He says we need to remember that this week. He says the work we're going to be called to won't end on Tuesday, on Election Day. He says it'll go on to Election Day plus 1, or Election Day plus 2, or plus 7, or plus 100. I think he's right. I think we're going to have a lot of work to do, not only as Americans, but for us as followers of Christ. In fact, I think the bar is set higher for us because we are the body of Christ. You see, we gather here and we proclaim to be followers of a Messiah who calls us to love our neighbor, who calls us to seek justice for those in the world who can't seek justice for themselves. A Messiah who's called us to go into the world to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to comfort the sick. A Messiah who reminds us when we do it for the least of those, we do it for him. And we do it when it's hard. We do it with people with whom we disagree. And we do it because we are followers of Christ first and foremost, even more so than because we are citizens of any nation. I think about it a lot in terms of what I learned when I took my intro zoology class in college. That's one of those classes where you learn a lot about taxonomy, whether you want to or not. You learn lots and lots of Latin names, those names which classify groups of animals based on common characteristics. If you've studied it all, you know we'll start with, there's kingdom, and then there's phylum, and then class, and order, and family, all the way down to species. And if I got those in the wrong order, my apologies to Dr. Gillis, who taught me zoology in 1984. But they define groups based on common traits, narrower and narrower and narrower as you get all the way down to species. But first, we are children of God. Secondly, then, I am a disciple of Jesus. Then, I'm a disciple of Jesus who lives in the United States of America. Being a disciple of Jesus, being a child of God, come before my nationality. And then, of course, we can continue down from there. I'm an American disciple of Jesus who practices his faith within the United Methodist Church. I'm a United Methodist American who lives in Kansas, or who lives in Topeka, or who likes Cornhusker football, or however you want to continue to divide us into ever and ever smaller groups. But who I'm called to be first and foremost is that child of God and that disciple of Jesus. That is the most important part of my life, more so than whether or not I worry about whether or not I'm a Kansan or a Nebraskan or anything else. I know when we gather here next Sunday, the world may have undergone some changes. We may have elected a new president. Different political parties may be in control of Congress, state legislatures. We could be seeing some political changes. One of my prayers is that it all happens peacefully. But amidst all that change, one of the things that won't change is that greatest commandment Jesus gave us, to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. So my invitation to you in these next couple of days, and then as we hit Election Day, and then as we hit Election Day +1, +2, and on. It's the same advice Wesley gave that society meeting he attended in 1774. First, I hope that you either have voted or will vote for the candidates you feel are most worthy. And I hope you have made that decision based on making an informed, educated, thoughtful decision. Second, then, as Wesley said, to not speak evil against someone because it wasn't the candidate you voted for. Maybe the more modern way to think about that is to be gracious in victory and to be gracious in defeat. Because whoever is elected, those who are elected still have to govern. Now, we still have rights as citizens of this nation to speak our grievances against our government is part of what makes us proud Americans is our First Amendment to the Constitution. We can disagree, we can voice those opinions, and we can do it forcefully. But I don't think we have to do it in ways that degrade each other or degrade people who are elected. We can do it without doing what John Wesley said would have been speaking evil. And then that third one, which I think is the hardest maybe of all, to not let your spirit be sharpened against those on the other side. Or to remember that that person you meet who voted for the other candidate, that person you're sitting in front of in traffic who has that bumper sticker that just kind of makes your teeth grind a little bit and your blood pressure go up and you wonder how in the world they support that candidate. Remember, too, the person driving that car with that bumper sticker is a beloved child of God, created in God's image just as you and I are. And if we can do that, and if we can engage each other in ways that are thoughtful and where we listen to each other, I've often read that part of the problem in America today is we listen to respond instead of listening to understand. A friend of mine who is a pastor of a larger congregation a couple of years ago preached a sermon, and I forget. It was a more controversial topic, probably given the time frame, probably when some of the issues of human sexuality were coming up before General Conference at that time. And he was touching on some of that, and he got an email from one of his parishioners, and he said, you know, I'd really like to sit down and talk with you about this. Maybe we can get together for lunch one day this week, because I really want to tell you why I think you're wrong. And my friend said, I am okay with that. I welcome that. I want people to come and say, I disagree with you. Let's talk about it. That's better than somebody just getting mad and sitting there and grumbling or just going away. That's how we begin to find common ground, is by beginning to have those conversations. And see, I think if we do that, if we live our lives that way, I think that is some way where we become peacemakers. Not peacemakers in the way Roman emperors became peacemakers, through brute force and intimidation and simply trying to bend the world to their will. But peacemakers by living into who we're called to be, by loving God and by loving neighbor. And I think if we do that, then we do the work that we say is our mission. The mission of the United Methodist Church is, of course, to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. If we're doing that, we're taking some step, some small step in the world in which we live that we can influence to bring it just that much closer to being God's kingdom here on earth.